Hello, everyone. So, title of this is quite a mouthful, actually. Why automating data access helps Thomson Reuters gain a competitive advantage. Really, I would say it's about our Immuta journey. That's probably a better title now that I think about it in retrospect. We're going to talk about an introduction, both of me and of Thomson Reuters. I'm going to talk about the challenges that we identified at the beginning of that journey. Once we had those challenges, we had to take a look at what our strengths and our weaknesses were in order to figure out how we're actually going to solve them. And then eventually we identified Immuta as one of the methods that we could get across that bridge. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the culture at Thomson Reuters and how it's shifting to embrace data and data security. And then I hopefully get more questions than Yarek did. So that's me, as I said. Introduce me first. My name's Peter Jacob. I actually have another last name, but I don't make anyone pronounce that, including me. But that is technically my last name. I'm a math, stats, and business guy, so I love to talk about that stuff. And I was formerly a competitive swimmer, and that's not why I have this haircut, unfortunately. So I've been with Thomson Reuters since 2018, and I started on the tax side with the one-source data engine. And the mandate that I had at that point was unifying the data layer of all the corporate tax products. And what I found about a couple years into my journey was that I couldn't really succeed at that without being a part of the overall data and analytics organization at Thomson Reuters. And that's where I am today. So that's how I got to being the VP of Data Lake, where I get to make more decisions closer to the enterprise, not just at the tax side, but also across the legal side and across Reuters. So when it comes to Thomson Reuters as an organization, we're primarily known for the Reuters brand. So people identify us with media, with the newspaper, those kinds of things, and also finance and risk. That's a little bit of a mistake since we divested finance and risk right when I joined in 2018. And primarily we make our revenue off of tax and legal products. So we're in the SaaS space, mostly off of tax and legal. I've once heard us described as the biggest company that you don't know what you actually buy from. And it's true, we're pretty much everywhere. We're a leader in the tax space, we're a leader in the legal space. We own the Westlaw Library, which is kind of our golden child, as you might say. And we're going through a lot of transformations right now with varying degrees of success because they're hard. One of them is what a lot of legacy companies are doing, DC exit, so moving to the cloud. We're still going through that, a lot of lifting and shifting. With that comes pivot to platform. So it's not just selling products anymore, but it's now selling platforms. How can we sort of cross-sell across legal? How can we cross-sell from small businesses to enterprise for tax? We're asking those kinds of questions. And we're shifting from a holdco to being more of an operating company. So what that means is we're not just an investment product from the Thomson family anymore. We are now actually trying to shift to strategically and holistically think of the company for opportunities like pivot to platform and cross-selling. And lastly, but not least, the data and analytics transformation. So that's a very logical thing to start thinking about when you're doing these other kinds of transformations, be it cloud, pivot to platform, DC exit. You're probably going to start thinking about what does that imply for your data and analytics transformation. So let's talk about that data team at Thomson Reuters. So we are a data-first company, so we were probably thinking about that for a long time, right? No, it's pretty new. It fell under basically software, under IT, and data was very much a second-class citizen, even though we were a data-first company. Now, that might sound confusing at first, but I think if we're being honest with ourselves, a lot of legacy companies had that problem. That is, they kind of dumped data and software as the same thing. Today, I think we see that differently as data grows, as the technology in data grows. We need a strategy around that. And that kind of started with the hiring of our first chief data officer in May of 2020. So that's my boss, Glenda Crisp. She couldn't be here, so you have to deal with me instead. So right now, our data team is divided into the data lake, which is my group. I'm biased. I think it's the most important one. It is actually sort of the source or the central technology that everything else revolves around. The other teams, such as governance, I think it's important that governance is a separate team from your data lake. That is, you want someone who has their eye on compliance, who isn't actually implementing this stuff. That is, you don't want the implementers to be the people who have their eye on compliance. You don't want the people who are being, let's say, enforced by the police to be the same people as the police. So that's why I think it's important to have that separate. You've got master data. Where the line from master data and data lake is always a topic of debate, but master data in our world is generally concerned with data models that live in the data lake. We've got analytics. Again, where that line is always a topic of debate. The analytics team is generally concerned with the overall process of the use cases, so beginning to end. Where did the use case start? Where does it end up? And in that theme, we've got AI, ML, and BI, which is sort of part of those analytics use cases, but that's sort of the end of the process. That's where the data lands, and they're concerned about what tooling they have and what are the strategies they have around that end. And then once we do all of that, we've got tooling and legacy software. So as we're evolving as a company through data and analytics, we find that we've got a lot of tools that just aren't useful anymore. They're not cutting it. And we need to figure out a way how to deprecate these things and move on to bigger and better things. So let's talk about what we're trying to do within data and analytics. And this is obviously just going to be high level. It's not going to be exhaustive by any means, because we're trying to do a lot of things. So we're trying to deprecate old data warehouses. I should also say we're trying to deprecate old data lakes, too. We call it the data puddle problem. We have it all over the company. People have been trying to build their own analytics solutions, so we're trying to deprecate those, bring them all into one master data lake. In doing so, we're hoping to find some savings. Why $100 million? Because it's a nice number that impresses the board. Like, I'm not joking. Someone just kind of said, hey, if we saved $100 million through deprecating stuff, that would sound pretty good, wouldn't it? Yep. We don't know where that number came from, but we know that if we did it, it would sound really good. And we're pretty close to achieving it, actually. So, and the last one is kind of where I started out, unifying data products across tax and legal. So right now, tax and legal are quite siloed. Even products within tax and legal are quite siloed. So we're taking a look at how we can unify that data layer, not just within tax and within legal, but across the whole organization. So the data stack. I actually don't like talking about the data stack, because whenever I do, I joke that it looks like the back of a developer's laptop. Like, you just get a whole bunch of stickers, and you don't really know what you're talking about. So this list is by no means exhaustive. There are going to be people that I haven't talked about. There are important vendors and partners that should be on here and that aren't there. So sometimes people say, like, hey, you guys didn't mention Airflow, for example. Do you use Airflow? Absolutely. Do we use DBT? Yep. Do we use SageMaker? Uh-huh. It's not on there. These are the ones that I think are important for this conversation. But the point that I'm trying to make here is, if we're going to choose a new vendor or a new partner, they have to play nice with everybody else here. That is, if somebody on here says, hey, we're not going to use, or we don't play nicely with Fivetran, that's going to be a problem for us. So every one of these is helping us do something strategic. So if you're going to come into that environment, you're going to have to play nicely with everybody else. So we're on to the challenges that we found. So the first challenge, we're not data security experts. And here I am, like, running the data lake, and I'm telling you we're not data security experts. That should probably be worrying, right? Yeah, and it is. But what I really mean by this is there are security experts at the company that aren't data experts. And there are data experts at the company that aren't security experts. And what we had to do was find a way to bridge that gap. On that point, we had a lot of legacy approaches that were limiting. By that I mean the security experts had ideas of how security should be implemented. And according to data people, those things just weren't practical. But they were working off of sort of legacy blueprints, off of sometimes what I would call an on-prem world. So we were looking at something that would help us bridge that gap. Data pipeline bottlenecks. What we mean here is that we found that the way we were doing things really caused problems in trying to grant people access or grant people whatever security requirements that they had. And compliance is complex. So we've already heard from JP Morgan on this fact, but we run a very complex organization. We're in 126 countries, probably thousands of jurisdictions, some of which change monthly, some of which change daily, and in one really special case, actually changes hourly, which is, we can talk about that later on. But it's really hard, and we need help keeping an eye on it. We need experts in those respective spaces to help us solve those problems. And we just don't have the manpower to do it. So we've identified our challenges. Now we have to sort of acknowledge our strengths and weaknesses. And I've just hit on that already. So what we realized is we do have this complex business. We have a lot of problems to solve, but we don't have the staff or the in-house expertise to solve it. So a lot of the time, someone will come to me and say, like, hey, Google does it this way. Amazon does it that way. Netflix does it this way. Facebook does it that way. And in those times, I have to say something like, great, we're not Facebook, and I'm sorry for that. If we're going to operate that way, we have to compete with them for talent. So that's a really hard place for us to be, to compete with those big guys for talent, where they're throwing tons of dollar signs at kids that are fresh out of school. We're a legacy company. We're a lot slower moving. We need to figure out ways that we can still compete without throwing those dollar signs that they do. So the way we do it is we realized very early on we need to lean on managed services. We need to find experts in the space, which you could see from the data stack that we were already doing that. So the more we lean on managed services, the faster we can develop because these problems are already solved. And my team can be smaller and more focused on what we're trying to do. So I talked about closing that data security gap before. And the first thing that we had to do when we were trying to check those boxes off of choosing a partner or a vendor in this space, it basically had to check all of the feature requirements. And we found that Immuta just did. Not just from like features, but also from scalability and future-proofing. That is, if we have a company like ours, 150 years old, but still has to change in the ways that I've described, holdco, pivot to platform, DC exit, all of these other things at the same time, we're going to need to find a way to future-proof the feature set that we already have. We need to find a product, as I've already mentioned, that plays nice with all of the other managed services that we have in our tech stack. And we need to bridge that gap between the data experts and the security experts. So those are the kind of three things that we needed to really do to choose a product. Spoiler alert, we chose Immuta. So I went to my team and I said, hey guys, I'm going to be presenting on Immuta. Tell me all the good things about it. And the first thing they said was this, that Immuta manages security, but Snowflake enforces it. So that goes to that point where it has to play nice. So what we wanted was a tool that already worked with that stack, that makes it easier to work with those policies, and could just sit right on top of Snowflake. So that meant that there wasn't really any difference in workflow or extra overhead required from our users. Decoupling policy from platform. So Immuta is not a runtime dependency. This is massive. So I always yell at people at my company for coupling things too tightly. Why do you do that? It's faster. It's easier. When things are tightly coupled, you get a really nice user experience until something goes down, and then everybody's unhappy with you. So this, while I bet I wouldn't be surprised if Immuta didn't even think about this when they were joining. This was just business as usual. But for us, this is a big deal. So it gave us that flexibility to grow. Again, what we found is that our company's changing a lot. We don't know what it's going to look like after all of these transformations. We don't know what it's going to look like in 10 years. It might be a completely different company. We needed something that had the flexibility to scale with us. So we had the reduction of those bottlenecks that we had before. So we had that data stewardship is actually something we keep talking about at Thomson Reuters. So we wanted to really democratize that data security, which when I say that, it kind of scares people at the company. But what we really want to do is push that out to as many stakeholders as possible so that they understand how their security is working, how their access is working. And we can do that in a way that doesn't require engineers to be typing lines of code in order to modify these things or get printouts of these things or report on these things. So I said that my team said all the other ones there. This last one here, this one's mine. Because this is something that I really value. So when I find a product that really hits home, that really does its job well, it means that my team can now focus on what they're good at. So that increases our potential innovation, and it just means that I don't have to have the head count for any other things that, like to solve the problems that Immuta is actually solving for us. And it also trains us in the best practices in the space. So as I've said before, we got data experts, we got security experts. Security experts understand best practices in the security space. Data experts understand best practices in the data space. What Immuta trains us to do is actually have an understanding that is right in between, in the data security space. So this is a slide that I use a lot because a lot of the time there's confusion around what a data lake even is. It's a sort of a catch-all term. I say it's a glorified S3 bucket because it's just you throw everything into it and you kind of figure it out later. But the problem with the way that I'm talking about it is because it's a catch-all term, there's a temptation to throw capabilities in there or services in there. And then you can make a real mess of what your team is trying to do. It's not a very disciplined kind of way to code. But in general, what you're going to have are these kinds of capabilities. You'll have a factory that is concerned with the ingestion problem. You're going to have the raw layer. So you're just going to land the data as raw as possible. And that's what I mean by you're going to worry about that later. You're then going to transform it into some kind of generic layer that could be a business vault, could be data vault. It could be a dimensional model that represents your organization. And then finally, you're going to have some way where you can create data spaces or sandboxes for your stakeholders so they can work on the data and attach their BI tools or their applications to that data there. So in essence, what you have are four main features, or this is the way I look at it. I think everyone's got some kind of a variation on this, but you've got ingest, you've got raw, conform, and then availability. When it comes to how we architected it, we've got Snowflake at the beginning of the pipeline. And you might ask, that doesn't make sense. Why do you have Snowflake at the ingest side? Well, we actually have Fivetran there, and we also have Power Center there, and we have Matillion there. Like I said, it's a laptop thing, like before. But we have Snowflake there because as Snowflake grows, we can actually use Snowflake's data sharing capabilities to land data in Snowflake at times. And that means that if we got Snowflake there, we can have Immuta helping us govern that. By the same logic, in the raw layer, we have Snowflake as well. And we've got Immuta helping us govern that. Similar objection here, hey, if it's in Snowflake, it's probably not raw. Well, if all of your sources are SQL sources, and you've just attached something like a Fivetran to it, you land it in Snowflake, that's pretty close to raw. And I would argue that no matter what you do, when you extract data, you never actually get it raw. You can get it as raw as possible, but it's never really raw. People think of raw as like S3 or some kind of network attached storage, but it really is only as raw as possible because you always transform the data in some way. On your vault and your dimensional model, that's where Snowflake really hits its stride, and that's where Immuta is probably going to do most of the heavy lifting for us, because this is the part that is going to be the really valuable data. This is where people are going to go to get that data. And then in the data spaces, this is the specific use cases. So once it's been extracted from your dimensional model or your vault, it's going to land in those specific data spaces, and we have another opportunity to manage access, and have governance on there. So as you can see, we use Snowflake and Immuta sort of as partners everywhere in the pipeline. It really helps us move quickly through each one of these stages and helps us build that lake. So last slide, I promise. So one of the things I talk about is that we think that these are technological problems because I'm talking about technology, and we have people typing things on keyboards and moving quickly and all of these kinds of things. But when it comes down to it, the technological problem has already been solved. It's not really that big a deal. The real problem that we have are cultural problems. So that is, how do we build trust in the things that we're building? How do we build faith from other parts of this large, old, complex organization so that they can adopt our product, so that they don't continue building these silos or these puddles in other parts of the company? And Immuta helps us simplify that, or helps us with that trust by democratizing data security. So that was sort of the data stewardship model that I was talking about. If we can push that out to the rest of the company and they understand how security works and how data security works, they build trust because now they've had a hand in it. And because it's easy to use, it helps us train the rest of the company in how data security should work too. So they're sort of unconsciously learning this is how data security should be. We probably take a lot of this for granted today, but this happened the same way with cloud. A lot of the same sort of reservations existed about cloud, about AWS, about Google Cloud, about Azure, and so on and so on. But the easier they were to use, the easier they were relative to the on-prem solutions, the faster adoption went on the other side. And the analogy that I use a lot of the time is APIs. If you've ever run a dev team, you can see how they mature when they've used good APIs or they build good APIs. Because once that contract is in place and they have a great interface, it teaches other teams how to interface with you and you to interface with other teams. And I think that Immuta is in a spot where they can start training my company and all other companies in a way on how data security should actually work. And from what I'm saying here, you kind of get this cool virtuous cycle where we have ease of use, drives adoption, then you get improved productivity, and then you get better business outcomes, which just keeps on cycling through. I actually have a funny kind of story as an example on this point. Because I say that like this is getting trained with like good APIs and all of that. When I was putting together this PowerPoint deck, I actually sent it off to the Immuta folks here. And they took like one look at it and said, this is complete garbage. And they sent it back, and it looks like this now. But this is kind of what I mean. When we as legacy companies try to build these things ourselves, like we kind of know how they should look. We know what we're talking about. We've been in the space. We get it. But the PowerPoint decks suck. And you want to give it to somebody who knows what they're talking about. And they can give you that polish and that best practices. And ultimately, that tells a better story. And once you have a better story, drives more adoption. So that's kind of what I'm saying here. That was my last slide. Thank you.